It is supposed to be the highest of arts. And the difficulties arise because music is transient and ephemeral. While it has the ability to convey an aesthetic message in purely abstract terms, but its analysis poses to be quite difficult. Because we are not passive receptors of stimuli. Music impressions are transformed into structures and concepts that enable us to grasp music, and we need to understand music through the conceptual framework. Now, fortunately, the afternoon we had, in the morning session, we had quite a lot of discussion how technology is a bit disruptive, technology is in some ways antithetical to art, but it also gives us an advantage. The first thing we forget is that replicability. Music can be recorded, it can be played. Today, if someone said, so-and-so sang a Kadak Bijli Ki Taan, you would like to hear it. It cannot be a metaphorical description. You have to actually, you can hear it as a recorded piece. So we don't have to totally depend on memory for recall. Then, of course, we have greater and greater computational abilities have helped us, and software is there. I remember somewhere in the 90s when I was interested in the subject, I went to TIFI where a gentleman was working on this. And it was a very simplified system. There was no software of the kind that an amateur like me could use. But now the situation has changed, and we are very lucky that at least in some ways it helps us supplement our understanding of music. Now, basically, I'm using a program called Sonic Visualizer with a Melodia plugin. The Sonic Visualizer, I think, is made by St. Mary's Singh, and the Melodia plugin is University of Barcelona. Alongside that is a program in Python, for which I'm grateful to IIT Bombay and Dr. Kaustukanti Ganguly, who guided me through this. So I've examined the data through such analysis against a conceptual background. Melographs and melograms have been in existence for a long time. I read somewhere in one of the earlier literature that there was something called the Melodic Music Analyzer, which came after the melograph, somewhere in the 60s. But it never got popular. But the work that has been done by Wim van der Meer and Dr. Suvarnalata Rao using Pratt, which is basically a software for linguistics and speech analysis, they have put up an excellent site. I don't know how many people are aware of it. It's called Music in Motion, or OTRIM, which is available from the NCPA site. That's a great thing for amateurs like me who want to learn a little more about music and sing. Now, we have different approaches to the Raga. The classical one is the aesthetic definition. The short form of it is Ranjayate iti Raga, that which pleases. But this is an aesthetic criterion which is very difficult to use, because all ragas may not be as distinct to each person. And there are several such definitions. But because of the difficulty of using such definitions, basically we see a raga from its structural attributes, the scale that is allowed to use, the tones that you can use, the ascent and descent pattern, intonation, emphasis, importance of tones. So this is one view. But the other aspect of the raga that interests me is its psychological or cognitive side as a re-identifiable particular. You listen to one thing and you listen to something 5 days later, even a month later, and you say, oh, I've heard this before. And yet they're not the same thing. And this was very perspicaciously put by a bandmaster who worked with the British forces somewhere in 1834. He says, it's not strictly a tune. It's likewise not a song. For able performers can adapt the words to any ragini, nor does the change of time destroy its inherent quality. So this is the aspect that I've tried to understand, and since this is the most fundamental concept in Hindustani and Indian classical music, so I began this by trying to examine what are these re-identifiable particulars, what are the factors that make you again and again recognize these things. Are these motives and pakars, as we say, or chalans or contours or something else. It has been suggested that raga should also be visualized as a gestalt, because we speak of rag swarup. It's a totality in its own. And gestalt gives us some things of how we perceive the raga. If it is incomplete, if you hear just one phrase, the mind adds back the other phrase and makes it whole. And such principles operate in helping us recognize the raga. But more importantly, I wanted to approach this from the point of view of musical cognition, an approach that focuses on the mind. Because in the end, however much technology and techniques we use, it is the mind which puts it together. Now, the funny thing is that, for visual missings, you can explain the objective things. There's a line, In the case of rag, it becomes very difficult. You are, in the end, forced to depend only on metaphors, on parallels. You say a rag moves up or it goes up and down. Nothing moves. Nothing really goes up and down. It's only a metaphor. Because in our brain, we cannot understand how it is perceived. We use these visual metaphors to try and understand it. Now, normally, the process of cognition are categorization, then cross-domain mapping, which I mentioned, because you cannot see a rag as it is, so you transport it into another domain, into the visual domain, and you say, it rises, it falls, it goes straight, it goes crooked, things like that. So this is what lies at the back of our mind when you identify a raga or this thing. So while it's a melodic organization, similar to a mode which is used in ethnomusicology for similar systems, whether it's the Persian things or the Arabic maqam, this is a concept which is common to all this, which is the form of organization. And all these are modal entities. So basically they have a scale and typical melodic patterns which allow us to recognize it. Now, when we spoke about how difficult it is to understand music, pitch is a psychological construct. It's what we learn. There are a continuum of frequencies, and yet we select certain ones. And here in between pitches as out of tune. So categorical perception, we have something in our mind that allows us to categorize it so that we can see them as distinct pitch classes rather than continuum. And all cultures have had this thing. Either you have 5 tones or 7 tones. There are some few cultures which may not have this kind of thing. But by and large, it seems to be a tendency of the human mind to categorize this. Now, while on this topic, I'm going to come to a slightly controversial thing in my viewpoint. A lot is spoken about the concept of Shruti in Indian music, that there are 22 Shrutis, and in different ways they add up. And between certain intervals, there's a certain number of Shrutis. But the point is this, that the human mind can only recognize certain pitch classes. So how do Shrutis fit into it? And a very good explanation has been offered by Snyder in his book called Music and Memory. There are 2 ways in which we distinguish between music. Either it is a discriminatory task of 2 immediate notes. There we can discriminate between them. But if we hear a note once, and after, say, 10 seconds or 15 seconds, we hear a slightly different form of that note, we still equate them as the same. Because the memory which makes this distinction can only keep certain categories immediately in itself. But when the categories are separated far apart, 2 categories which are roughly similar seem to be, and I think this is a great thing of concept of nuance. And Indian music, because it's reliance on a totally different approach of nuances, of means, of gamaks. So I will not say that one note is flatter, less flat, but there is some kind of a distinction that the mind makes, and which is what makes Indian music so interesting. It's not as structural as Western music. They say nuances are only used for conveying emotion. But I think Indian music relies largely on these kind of nuances, and that's what it gives it its particular distinctiveness and shape. And there's a lot of discussion on this. And one of the reasons, I think, that why nuances have to be taught, we discussed this in the morning, to the Guru Shishya Parampara, is we can't notate a particular nuance. It is by, by constant practice and repetition that you understand the nuance. So that's where it comes in, and that's where probably any kind of mechanized learning or this will not help you. So the perception of pitch takes place under two different circumstances. First, the pitches are in immediate succession, where the echoic memory can make the distinction, because it can take that much. But when the pitches are far apart, then this becomes an identification task. I'll just cite this thing from Magriel. My conviction is that the mean, a meticulously conceived sliding between notes, is the most distinctive feature of Hindustani music and is responsible for much of this music's emotional power and profundity. So, and the complexities of the Rag gestalt are probably best learned by the subconscious mind in the course of oral transmission, and are possibly too complex for the conscious mind to fully grasp and categorize. So this explains what Indian music, why it's distinct, why it doesn't fall into the patterns of, syntax, musical syntax and expressiveness, that distinction that is normally made. Now, of course, a melody is a sequence of notes, but it has to be integrated. The mind has to integrate it. The tones have to be perceived as grouped, and grouping is, of course, a natural tendency. We group things together, we categorize things, and that helps us to deal with large amounts of information. Chunking is what it's psychologically referred to, chunking at lower and higher levels, and that is how cognition takes place. The other very important thing which I feel for understanding Raga is a psychological concept called the schema or schemata. These are cognitive constructs, associations in long-term memory. We can be different kinds of schemata. You can have a schemata about what a khayal recital should be like or what a drupad recital should be like, but you also have melodic schemata like what a rag is. Now, schemata is a very diffuse kind of a concept. Probably a performer would have a more detailed schemata in his mind because he has learnt it very often. And I'm approaching it from the point of view and a very ordinary listener who has been exposed to some amount of Indian music, but has not learnt it. But yet, a couple of listenings, a couple of exposures, and this schemata gets fixed in his mind. Each time he listens to more of that music, the schemata gets more and more detailed in his mind. So I think that this schemata is a good way to explain how we understand music and how we can recognize music, how we can recognize rags. So I consider that each rag is a schema, and it has motivic categories, such as what we call the chalans. It is also the contour patterns. You realize how it rises, how it descends. Now, this is all that we speak of in music also. Aroho, avaroho, but the mind takes it up into a particular form, and that's where. And some of these are very critical for understanding some rags. It is not the manner in which the notes are sung, it's not how long you pause on a note, what is a nyasa note, whether a nyasa, what distinguishes, say, Marva from this thing is the way you take the notes. For me, it's a much simpler process. And I took a couple of rags and I used it using Sonic Visualizer and Outrim. I will not go into the details because I won't bore you with it. But there are two aspects. One is the prescriptive aspect. Indian music, you will find a number of authoritative works, where there's Bhatkande, which is older, or there are things like Omkarnath Thakur's Sangeetanjali, Ramshankar Jha's book. They all give the structural aspects, the normative aspects. These are the notes. This is how you should pause. As against that, I would like to show you how I have done this using Sonic Visualizer, which allows me to this thing. I have imported Amir Khan's Marva, and I have done pitch extraction from this, which allows us to so the volume's a bit high. So you can see the frequency at which he's singing, and then through a normalization program, either we're using the histogram that this program generates, you can work out what his tonic is. I have also done a little bit of cheating. There's a very interesting publication that has come out. It's called Songs of the Khayal by Nicholas McGreal, where about 100 bandishes have been notated. And he's a sarangi player, so he has the ear to distinguish. And that comes along with CDs of MP3 CD with both, particularly phrases sung slowly, means analyzed. And we were talking this morning about Bhatkhande and Paluskar's system of notation. Nicholas McGreal has refined it even further and used that in his transcriptions. So I use that as a backup to try and understand this singing of Marva. And did it unplug? I think I missed out. Huh? So this is this thing from Nicholas McGreal. This thing, he takes the stai, each phrase, and he just see how minutely he has been able to analyze the music there. And using that because I'm not a musician, but using that along with this kind of sonic visualization of the contours, I was able to understand a little more of Marva. And the first thing that struck me, and it is, I would at this moment like to say that Veena-ji also there's a YouTube recording of her in which she beautifully explains Marva, and how it pauses, or that between that resolution is not there, between the ma and the re. That is the descent, that is where it pauses, that is where the soul of Marva lies. And this I consider is one of the critical schemas for a lay person or a beginner to recognize Marva. Similarly, there are other rags which I'm trying to analyze, and some of the things that, I'm not showing it here because I don't want to sing, but two problems struck me. One was, why is Kishori Amankar's bhoop so different from the other bhoops? And this provides us with the means of understanding why her means are different, why is it? It is always alleged that hers moves closer to Shuddha Kalyan. And this can be examined objectively using a program like this. The second one which struck me was the Amir Khan Nand, which is actually a Dasapriya Bandish, E Bara Bara Saiya, Tokas Sakala Bana Dhundu. Now, that is a very classical Nand that the moment you hear it, you realize this is Nand. On the other hand, you hear Kumarji's Nand, which is Rajana, Bato Aja, and the two seem so dissimilar that you're thrown into a doubt. Are these both Nand? Am I listening to Nand? And then when you look at it from a program like this, you realize where it happens. Because there are certain means that indicate Nand in a Vilambit Bandish. Whereas, because Kumarji's is a little, Drut, the timbre of his voice is slightly different. And the means don't come through that fast. So that's why you don't get a sense of Nand as you understand it in this. So this is how I have been using software and to understand the motives, to understand how the performance is, this thing. So finally, for my mind, the raga is a traditional musical form, but it should be viewed as a schema. That is how we understand how the mind absorbs it, and it has a better explanatory value. It explains how both the listener and the performer perceive it and how they come together. I have a very sketchy schema in my mind. The performer, because of his practice, because of his listening, has a more detailed. So he looks at all the nuances, he looks at all the fine points, he has been taught to sing phrases in that way. But I, as an ordinary listener, find common ground because I find a few sentences or a few phrases there that convey the rag to me. And that is how a schema bridges the gap. And schemas get more and more detailed as you listen more and more. If you are exposed more to music, you become very familiar with the musical idiom and you can sing. But for a beginner, I find that software like this is helpful if you're really interested in understanding what a particular music piece is, how it progresses, how the rag comes through. And I have tried to use this, and I'm sharing this with you in the hope that you might find some of this useful. Thank you.